At 7:15 a.m. on May 20th, 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Otto Scherber jumped from a Ju-52 transport aircraft at 400 feet above Maleme Airfield on Crete. Before his parachute fully deployed, he could see British and Greek defenders firing upward at the wave of German paratroopers filling the sky. Men around him were hit in mid-air bodies, jerking as bullets struck parachutes, collapsing soldiers falling the remaining distance to impact the ground at terminal velocity. Scherber hit hard-rolled and immediately came under fire from positions he couldn't see. His rifle was in a weapons canister that had dropped somewhere else. Standard procedure meant paratroopers landed armed only with pistols and grenades. Around him, men were dying before they could reach their weapons cut down in the most vulnerable moments of an assault that had looked brilliant in planning rooms in Berlin, but was proving catastrophic in execution. Operation Mercury. The airborne invasion of Crete was the first time in history that an island had been conquered entirely from the air, without amphibious landings, without naval support, using only paratroopers and glider-borne troops. In the first 6 hours, it appeared to be failing catastrophically. By the end of the first day, German casualty rates exceeded 40% in some units. Yet within 10 days, Crete would fall, and the world would understand that airborne assault had fundamentally changed how wars could be fought. This is the story of Operation Mercury, Hermann Göring's vision of conquest from the sky, the elite Fallschirmjäger who executed it, and the brutal chaos of the world's first major airborne invasion, where revolutionary tactics met the reality of landing under fire with half your unit scattered across miles of hostile terrain. The concept of airborne assault had existed since World War I, but practical application remained theoretical through the 1920s and 30s. Parachutes were unreliable. Transport aircraft couldn't carry enough men to be tactically significant. Coordination between air and ground forces was primitive. Most military theorists considered airborne operations useful only for small-scale raids or reconnaissance insertions, not conventional assault. The Soviet Union experimented with mass parachute drops during exercises in the 1930s, but these were demonstrations rather than combat operations. No nation had attempted to conquer territory through airborne assault alone. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, believed airborne forces could revolutionize warfare. His vision went beyond small unit tactics to strategic operations, capturing key objectives deep behind enemy lines, seizing airfields before defenders could react, creating chaos in the enemy rear that would collapse defensive positions. Properly employed elite airborne troops could achieve in hours what conventional ground forces needed days or weeks to accomplish. The key was surprise speed and concentration of force at decisive points. Göring created the Fallschirmjäger German paratroops as an independent force under Luftwaffe command rather than army control. This organizational decision reflected his belief that airborne operations required fundamentally different doctrine training and mentality than conventional ground combat. The Fallschirmjäger would be volunteers physically superior, extensively trained and indoctrinated with aggressive offensive spirit. They would be Germany's elite comparable to SS formations, but under Luftwaffe authority. The training regime was brutal. Candidates underwent 6 months of intensive preparation before earning their parachutist badge. Physical conditioning exceeded army standards, long-distance running obstacle courses, hand-to-hand combat, swimming in full equipment. Parachute training began with jumps from towers, and scaffolding progressed to balloon jumps and culminated in aircraft jumps under various conditions. But the training went beyond physical preparation. Fallschirmjäger doctrine emphasized initiative aggression and ability to function independently when dispersed. Officers and NCOs were taught to accomplish missions even when separated from higher command, adapting to circumstances rather than waiting for orders. The equipment issued to Fallschirmjäger reflected their unique operational requirements. The parachute itself, the Ozid series, used a single attachment point on the back rather than the dual attachment harnesses used by other nations. This created a distinctive forward tumbling opening that was faster but more violent, requiring special landing techniques to avoid injury. paratroopers wore baggy jump smocks over their uniforms, designed to prevent equipment snagging during exit. Steel helmets were specially designed without brims to reduce wind resistance and prevent neck injuries during opening shock. The weapons loadout represented the most significant compromise in Fallschirmjäger equipment. Jumping with rifles was considered too dangerous. The weapons could snag in rigging lines, injure the paratrooper during landing, or be damaged on impact. Instead, rifles, machine guns, and heavy weapons were packed in cylindrical containers that dropped separately on their own parachutes. Paratroopers jumped armed only with pistols, grenades, and knives. This created a critical vulnerability period between landing and reaching weapons containers when paratroopers were nearly defenseless. The first combat test of Fallschirmjäger came during the Norwegian campaign in April 1940. Small-scale jumps captured key airfields, allowing conventional forces to fly in reinforcements. The operations were successful but limited in scope, hundreds of paratroopers, not thousands, seizing objectives with minimal resistance. The real validation came during the invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. Fallschirmjäger seized bridges at Rotterdam and captured Fort Eben-Emael in Belgium, using glider-borne troops with specialized demolition equipment. These operations demonstrated that airborne forces could achieve strategic objectives, capturing critical terrain before defenders could organize resistance. But Crete would be different. Crete wasn't a raid or a supporting operation for conventional ground forces. It was an entire campaign executed by airborne assault alone. The island was 160 miles long, defended by approximately 42,000 British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek troops. The terrain was mountainous, heavily vegetated with limited roads. 3 airfields, Maleme, Retimo, and Heraklion, were the key objectives. Capturing them would allow German reinforcements to land by transport aircraft, building combat power faster than defenders could react. The operational plan was complex. 3,000 paratroopers would drop on Maleme and nearby positions in the morning of May 20th. Another 3,000 would drop on Retimo and Heraklion in the afternoon. Glider-borne troops would seize critical positions around the airfields. Mountain troops would be flown in once airfields were captured. The entire force, approximately 22,000 men, would be committed within 48 hours. Speed was essential. Defenders outnumbered attackers initially, but German reinforcements arriving by air would reverse that numerical balance within days. The plan assumed several conditions. First, air superiority would suppress defensive fire during landings. Luftwaffe fighters and bombers would strafe and bomb defender positions immediately before paratroopers jumped, suppressing resistance during the most vulnerable phase. Second, surprise would prevent defenders from concentrating forces at drop zones. Third, Fallschirmjäger training and aggressive tactics would overcome the initial disadvantage of landing scattered and separated from heavy weapons. All 3 assumptions proved partly wrong. At 7:00 a.m. on May 20th, 1941, the first wave of transport aircraft approached Crete from the north. Defenders had been watching for days, knowing attack was imminent. British codebreakers had provided detailed intelligence about German plans, including objectives and timing. Troops were dug in around the airfields, weapons positioned to cover drop zones, communication lines established. When the Ju-52 transports appeared flying in formations at 400 feet altitude, defenders were ready. The preliminary bombing and strafing runs did suppress some defensive positions, but others remained operational. As paratroopers began jumping, ground fire intensified. The Germans were jumping from 400 feet to dangerously low altitude, chosen to minimize time in the air and reduce drift from wind. But low altitude also meant less time for parachutes to deploy and stabilize, creating harder landings and less ability to steer away from obvious danger. Worse, it put paratroopers within effective range of rifles and machine guns for their entire descent. Men were hit before their parachutes opened. The distinctive crack of British Lee Enfield rifles and the sustained fire of Bren guns tore through the formations. Some paratroopers were killed instantly, their bodies continuing to fall with partially deployed parachutes. Others were hit multiple times during descent, arriving dead or dying. Those who landed successfully came under immediate fire from positions they couldn't identify. The forward tumbling landing technique required by German parachutes left men disoriented and exposed for critical seconds. Defenders who had pre-registered firing lanes simply poured fire into areas where paratroopers were landing densest. The weapons containers added to the chaos. They dropped on the same parachutes as men, but with no control over landing location. Some containers landed in defended areas, forcing paratroopers to assault prepared positions armed only with pistols to reach their rifles. Other containers landed in ravines or heavy brush, impossible to locate quickly. Many were captured by defenders before paratroopers could reach them. The period between landing and securing weapons supposed to last only minutes in training exercises stretched to hours under combat conditions. Unit cohesion disintegrated immediately. Drop patterns scattered companies across miles of terrain. Officers landed separated from their men, platoons fragmented into small groups. The radio sets that should have coordinated actions were in containers that couldn't be located. Pre-planned objectives became impossible to execute when the units assigned to attack them were scattered and under strength. Small groups of Fallschirmjäger formed ad hoc combat teams, sometimes mixing soldiers from different companies who happened to land near each other. Lieutenant Rudolf Witziger landed in an olive grove 500 meters from his intended drop zone. His platoon, supposed to number 40 men, consisted of 11 soldiers he could locate in the first hour. They had no machine guns, no radios, and no contact with higher command. Witziger could hear heavy firing from multiple directions, but couldn't determine friendly from enemy positions. His orders had been to seize a British artillery position covering Maleme airfield, but he had no idea where the position actually was or how many defenders held it. He organized his 11 men oriented on the sound of aircraft engines from Maleme and began moving toward his objective. This became typical of Fallschirmjäger operations during the first days, small groups of paratroopers attacking objectives with whatever forces they could assemble, hoping that enough other groups were doing the same to accomplish the overall mission. The assault on Maleme airfield devolved into dozens of separate small unit actions. Some succeeded through skill and aggression. Fallschirmjäger training emphasized assault tactics close with the enemy, quickly use grenades, and close-quarter weapons, maintain momentum. These tactics worked when paratroopers reached their weapons and could concentrate force against specific positions. But many groups were wiped out before achieving anything. Defending forces, particularly New Zealand infantry battalions around Maleme, fought with discipline and determination. They'd seen the paratroops landing, understood the tactical situation, and concentrated fire on groups trying to organize. German casualty rates in the first 6 hours approached 50% in some companies. The afternoon drops at Retimo and Heraklion went worse. Defenders at these locations had observed the morning assault at Maleme and understood German tactics. They held fire until transport aircraft were directly overhead, then opened up simultaneously. The concentrated fire was devastating. Entire sticks of paratroopers, 12 men jumping from a single aircraft, were hit before reaching the ground. Aircraft were shot down while men were still jumping, causing mid-air collisions between paratroopers and flaming wreckage. The drop zones became killing grounds where bodies accumulated faster than survivors could organize resistance. Yet somehow, impossibly, the Fallschirmjäger continued attacking. This was where their training and indoctrination proved decisive. Despite catastrophic casualties, scattered units, and overwhelming defensive fire, small groups kept pressing forward. They attacked strongpoints with grenades and captured weapons. They infiltrated behind defensive lines to attack from unexpected directions. They gathered survivors into ad hoc units and launched coordinated assaults despite having no communication with higher command. The aggression that had been drilled into them through months of training overrode the rational response retreat and regroup, and kept them attacking even when circumstances suggested the operation had failed. The breakthrough came at Maleme. Major Walter Cox's glider-borne troops had landed directly on top of Hill 107, the high ground overlooking the airfield. They'd taken heavy casualties in the landing gliders crashed, were destroyed by defensive fire, or landed in minefields. But survivors captured part of the hill and began clearing bunkers with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Paratroopers scattered across the valley below began converging on Hill 107, recognizing it as critical terrain. By late afternoon, on May the 20th, German forces held a precarious foothold on the hill, but hadn't secured the airfield itself. The first night was chaos for both sides. German units were scattered, disorganized, suffering from command and control breakdown. But British Commonwealth defenders were equally confused. They'd inflicted horrific casualties on the attackers, but didn't know whether more drops were coming. Communication between defending units was fragmentary. Commanders couldn't assess overall situation. The New Zealand battalion defending Maleme withdrew from Hill 107 during the night, not in panic, but in a calculated decision to consolidate positions. This decision, though tactically reasonable, proved strategically catastrophic. On the morning of May the 21st, German commanders recognized that Hill 107 was no longer contested. They immediately began landing Ju-52 transports at Maleme, despite the airfield still being under fire. The landings were brutal. Aircraft were shot up on approach, crash-landed on damaged runways, or were destroyed by artillery fire after landing. But German air transport crews kept coming. Each aircraft that made it delivered mountain troops, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The reinforcement rate exceeded defender kill rates. By afternoon, German forces at Maleme had consolidated control of the airfield and were building combat power faster than defenders could react. The other drop zones remained contested. At Retimo, paratroopers were surrounded by Australian defenders and couldn't capture the airfield. At Heraklion, British forces contained German paratroopers in urban fighting that decimated both sides. But Maleme's capture made these secondary battles irrelevant. German reinforcements flying into Maleme could march overland to relieve isolated paratroop units and attack British positions from new directions. The tactical situation shifted from defenders containing scattered airborne forces to conventional ground combat, where German units had initiative and growing numerical superiority. The British decision to evacuate came on May the 27th, 10 days after the invasion began. Royal Navy ships evacuated approximately 16,000 troops from southern Crete, suffering heavy losses from Luftwaffe attacks during the operation. Another 12,000 British Commonwealth troops were captured. The Germans had won, captured Crete, secured airfields, established control over the eastern Mediterranean. But the victory came at costs that shocked the German high command. Fallschirmjäger casualties exceeded 6,000 killed or wounded, out of approximately 22,000 engaged. Casualty rates approaching 30%. Some battalions suffered over 50% casualties. 165 transport aircraft were destroyed, a loss rate that couldn't be sustained in future operations. Elite units that had taken years to train and equip were decimated in 10 days of combat. The Luftwaffe's transport fleet was crippled. Hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew were dead. Hitler's reaction to the casualty reports was immediate and definitive. He declared Crete the graveyard of the Fallschirmjäger and forbade future large-scale airborne operations. German paratroopers would continue to exist as units, but would fight primarily as conventional infantry. The revolutionary tactic that Goering had championed, that had looked so promising during the French campaign, had proven too costly when facing prepared defenders with adequate firepower. The world's first major airborne invasion would also be Germany's last. The Allies drew opposite conclusions. Despite losing Crete, British and American military observers recognized that airborne assault could work. The Germans had won despite suffering catastrophic casualties because the tactical concept was sound. Proper application, better intelligence, improved equipment, coordinated with ground forces, rather than independent operation, could make airborne assault decisive. The United States and Britain dramatically expanded airborne programs. American and British airborne divisions would conduct massive operations in Sicily, Normandy, Holland, and across the Rhine, applying lessons learned from Crete about coordination equipment and the necessity of link-up with conventional forces. The technical lessons were extensive. Weapons containers were recognized as a critical vulnerability. Allied paratroopers would jump with rifles and personal weapons, accepting increased injury risk rather than landing defenseless. Drop altitudes were increased to 600 to 800 feet, giving men more time in the air, but reducing casualties from ground fire during descent. Pathfinder teams would mark drop zones with beacons, and smoke improving accuracy and reducing scatter. Most critically airborne operations would be planned as part of larger operations, with link-up timelines, not as independent campaigns expected to succeed alone. The human cost of Crete haunted survivors on both sides. Fallschirmjäger, who jumped over Maleme, described landing zones covered with German dead weapons containers, surrounded by bodies of men who'd been killed trying to reach them, and the psychological trauma of watching friends shot out of the sky before their parachutes deployed. New Zealand defenders described the moral complexity of shooting paratroopers in mid-air legally combatants, but psychologically helpless victims, and the nightmarish efficiency required to kill men before they could reach weapons. Medical personnel on both sides were overwhelmed by casualties that exceeded any projections. The tactical innovations that made Crete possible, mass parachute insertion glider assault, rapid build-up through air transport, became standard practice in World War II and beyond. Every airborne operation since Crete has built on lessons learned there. The equipment evolved, improved parachutes, better weapons, integration helicopters, eventually replacing parachutes for assault insertions. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged. Elite infantry delivered directly to objectives, by air achieving surprise and speed, impossible with conventional ground forces. Yet Crete also demonstrated airborne assault's inherent limitations. Paratroopers landing in the face of prepared defenders with adequate firepower suffer catastrophic casualties. The window of vulnerability between landing and organizing effective resistance is measured in minutes, but can determine success or failure. Heavy weapons and supplies delivered by parachute scatter across drop zones, creating logistical nightmares. Link-up with conventional forces is essential. Isolated airborne forces can be contained and destroyed even when initially successful. These limitations constrained airborne employment throughout the war and continue to influence modern airborne doctrine. The Fallschirmjäger themselves became legendary despite, or perhaps because of their Crete casualties. They'd attempted something no military force had tried, before suffered losses that would have broken lesser units, and succeeded through sheer determination and aggressive action. Their combat record in subsequent operations, fighting primarily as elite infantry rather than paratroopers, earned them respect from opponents and allies alike. But Crete remained their defining operation, the moment when Goering's vision of conquest from the air met reality and proved both possible and prohibitively expensive. Looking at Crete today, German war cemeteries, holding thousands of Fallschirmjäger, tell part of the story. These men, average age 22 volunteers from across Germany, among the Wehrmacht's best trained and most motivated soldiers, died implementing a tactical innovation that changed warfare. They proved airborne assault could succeed. They also proved its terrible cost. The olive groves and drop zones where they landed still exist peaceful now, memorials marking locations where casualty rates exceeded 40% in the first hours of combat. The veterans who survived carried Crete's psychological weight for decades. They'd experienced something unique in military history, being first to attempt a revolutionary tactic, watching it nearly fail catastrophically, then succeeding through determination that bordered on fanaticism. They'd seen friends shot out of the sky, landed scattered and nearly defenseless, fought from position to position with weapons taken from dead comrades, and somehow accomplished objectives that seemed impossible. The experience created bonds and trauma that peacetime life never fully erased. The Battle of Crete represented the intersection of tactical innovation, operational daring, and the brutal reality that revolutionary concepts cost lives when tested in combat. Goering's vision of airborne assault was proven correct. Properly executed paratroopers could seize objectives conventional forces couldn't reach. But the execution required accepting casualty rates that made the tactic unsustainable for Germany. The Allies, observing from outside, saw the potential without experiencing the cost firsthand, and built massive airborne forces that would help win the war. That's the legacy of Operation Mercury, a tactical revolution purchased with blood. A strategic victory that convinced Hitler to abandon the tactic, and a demonstration that changed how every military force approached vertical envelopment and airborne assault. The world's first major airborne invasion succeeded, but cost so much that it became the last of its kind for the force that pioneered it. The Fallschirmjäger who jumped over Crete proved airborne assault worked. They also proved why it required careful application, overwhelming support, and acceptance of casualties that shocked even hardened commanders. Revolutionary tactics always cost the revolutionaries. The question is whether the cost is worth the results. At Crete, Germany decided it wasn't. The Allies, learning from German sacrifice, decided it was. Both conclusions were correct.